let's talk about how the left is fucked up, shall we? Only 2 MAGA hats. I was expecting more. Oh, 3. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you over there. But yeah, so I'm terrible at naming things, so I called this the ideological collapse of the left, understanding the progressive worldview and how it's diverged from observable reality, which I'm sure we've all noticed ourselves. Basically, we're going to be talking about their belief system and how it's manifesting its own internal contradictions. And once they've started doing that, they've got to start falling back on liberal axioms, not progressive ones. So they're basically, they need us to be right at this point.
I was going to go through and fisk the entirety of Sargon's talk, but fortunately for me, and fortunately for you, who would otherwise have to sit through it all, he stops talking about the left quite early on and starts talking about gender studies, race studies, all that kind of thing. So it's only really the first segment where he actually tries to address left-wing philosophy, and he gets an awful lot of things wrong. On the later stuff, maybe I agree with him a bit more, though I have been concerned by Sargon's slide to the right, but then so few left-wing voices will bother to engage with his content or what he says, so dibs on me, I suppose. It's interesting, however, to note that Sargon and others are so concerned about the entryism of what they think is left-wing thought into universities, into businesses, into all of these areas, but they have failed to notice the entryism of these things into the left, because many of their ideas and concepts, their precepts, run entirely counter to left-wing philosophy and thought, as we shall see.
Right, let's start with the very fundamentals of the progressive worldview. They've got a few axioms, but these are the ones that I think are the most important. All people are equal. Inequality is the consequence of discrimination, and discrimination causes oppression.
I think we can see already, right off the bat, Sargon is not so much talking about the left. I mean, he immediately launches into progressives, and there are many progressives who would reject the kind of progressive that he's talking about. So, yeah, already we can see that he's broad brushing a very broad church with one particular subset of modern understanding of a particular wing of political philosophy that in many ways cannot be said to be compatible with left-wing thought. He says these are the precepts upon which the left operates, albeit, yes, he's talking specifically about progressives, which goes against the title of his talk, but never mind. They kind of are and they kind of aren't. If I was to pick things that are the central precepts of left-wing thought, I would reference non-Marxist socialism as being the dominant actual political left-wing force in the world at the moment. That is a broad, comprehensive outlook on the human condition as a political theory. It's fairly new. It does tend to the economic, but from a social point of view. And it's kind of an outgrowth of liberalism. It's a natural extension of liberal thought. The tenets of that belief are the belief in equality. Now, that doesn't mean everyone is the same. This seems to be a point of contention and confusion. There are people who want to claim that everyone is exactly the same, but this isn't really a left-wing point of view. The equality that we're talking about there is equality of opportunity, equality before the law, egalitarianism, that all human beings, despite their differences, are equally entitled to a half-decent life and the same kind of opportunity to succeed as each other. So where we have inequalities, they have to be justified inequalities. And the onus is upon the person who defends these inequalities to produce the proof that they are acceptable. This will sound weird to people, but a central tenet of socialism, of the left is a limited role for the state, so as to avoid despotism, so as to avoid theocracy. The state, in a left-wing and a socialist point of view, if you even have one, depending on what extreme you're going to, the state is intended to act as an arbiter and a guarantor of those equal rights, of that reasonable provision that everyone would have, of enforcing the fact that people are treated equally before the law and that they have access to the same level of opportunity as each other. So it's not ceremonial, it's not religious. The state organizes those things over which people democratically decide to give it power over. The state is the manifest will of the people, their strength, their capability to do things, to enforce laws and rules, to distribute opportunity and resources in a fair way. That's the role for the state. It's the idea that socialism necessarily means the state controls everything. That's just not correct. It's finding the right level. Some people think we need more, some people think we need less, but the role of the state in socialism is very limited. And the third central precept is the elimination of systems of control. But this means unfair, unjustified systems of control, e.g. like the class system, over-concentration of wealth and the power of that wealth over government to corrupt and pervert it into cronyism and so on. This doesn't mean the elimination of private property, it doesn't mean the elimination of the wealthy, it just means having things in place to prevent too much power concentrating in the hands of too few, so that you continue to serve the general populace rather than a tiny, powerful, special interest group. So there's a constant expectation within that structure that the left is going to work to eliminate potential problem systems of control, such as too much wealth ending up in too many hands, or hereditary power, things like this. That's what it's for.
And so basically their ideology ends up running through something like this. They'll say, this stems from the Enlightenment belief that all men are created equal, and the radical left takes this to the extension of all people have equal worth. The differences are caused, therefore, by circumstance, not biology, which we know as social constructivism, and this is obviously. Yeah, I know, right? It's and if they're not equal in outcome, they should be made equal to offset discrimination. Yep, we're good, right? And then compare the ideological list they have to observable reality. People are created with equal rights, but not equal in not physical and material equality. People are not the same and are not of equal worth, because what has value is a personal judgment. You decide what has value. They can't just say there is a universal value for everyone. It's ridiculous. The differences are the consequence of both biology and circumstances, and a free society allows people to follow their personal interests that are unique to themselves, which will naturally have differing outcomes.
Classical left-wing thought, the overarching degree of left-wing thought, doesn't try to say that everyone is identical. It does argue that people should have equal rights and as close to equal opportunities as is possible. It recognizes the differences between people, but seeks to provide an environment in which most people of whatever level of ability can flourish to some degree, and that even if they can't, they have a base level of life that's worth living, a base quality of life, even if they're crippled or whatever else. You can negotiate the point to a degree. We do deny certain rights from people who are so mentally subnormal they cannot function. Things like that. There are exceptions, but by and large, what it's talking about is saying that human life, by virtue of being conscious human life, has a baseline level of worth, and regardless of your abilities, your wealth, the circumstances into which you were born, you should be allowed to rise or fall or entirely on your own merits, but not to fall too far. This is the idea of a welfare safety net, of social housing, of programs to help the disabled and so on. And yes, all social programs are a manifestation of socialist thought. Even militaries, especially the American military, which in many ways is the American welfare system. In a lot of ways it provides money for education, it provides housing, all the rest of it. It's like a micronation within the USA, and it's a great example of socialist largesse in many ways. But yes, people are different. But the point is that they shouldn't be denied their rights and so on, save where practicality demands it, simply because they're weak, stupid, female, coloured, gay, whatever else. You know, this is the point of left-wing thought. We say that everyone has equal rights and should have as close to equal opportunity as possible. Pointing to an extreme, radical extreme, a fringe of a fringe of a fringe in this way, doesn't do anyone any favours, and it paints the left as a whole as this irrational group of utter ideologues who cannot be reasoned with, and simply isn't the case. I mean, here I am. It used to be able to be said with pride that reality had a left-wing bias, and indeed it does, just not to the extent of these social constructivists and so on, but that's really more of an outgrowth of postmodernism. I consider socialism, left-wing thought, primarily to be an outgrowth of liberalism and of modernism, if anything.
Inequality is the consequence of discrimination. Well, ideologically, they think that all people have the same value, and therefore any differences in outcome are due to socialization and discrimination. Discrimination leads to unequal and therefore unjust outcomes, and this is how discrimination is oppression. The reality is that each person has a unique value judged by others. Differences are the consequences of biological and social factors, as we just covered. Unequal outcomes are inevitable, in fact, the inevitable consequence of a fair system that treats people as the individual that they are. And the inability to discriminate is actually oppression. Suppressing one's ability to choose and to be different from other people is how you're going to oppress people. I mean, was it Solzhenitsyn said, if people are equal, then they're not free, and if they are free, they're not equal. Something along those lines. And I think that's an absolutely salient observation when dealing with far-left ideology.
Like many terms, discrimination can have two meanings. You can be of discriminating taste, meaning that you prefer certain wines or cheeses or whatever else. But then there's discrimination in the sense that it should be being meant here, in that you harbour some degree of prejudice or whatever else towards a type of person. Maybe you don't like black people. Maybe that's the form of discrimination we're talking about here. And that is unfair, then, because you're not gauging them upon their capability or their worth as a person as a result of what their capabilities are, but upon the colour of their skin. And this kind of discrimination, unfair discrimination, it needs that qualifier, shouldn't be allowed. So, inequality isn't necessarily the product of discrimination, but discrimination can emerge as a product of inequality. We all probably stand in judgment upon people who appear to be shabby, who have accents that are associated with impoverished areas. I think a large part of the confusion in US politics around race and class comes from the fact that because the black community started out poor, and because the American social system is one of the least socially mobile ones in the first world, the black community has become synonymous with poor. And if you look at the kind of discriminatory thoughts and so on held about black people in the US, you will find them mirrored about white chav populations in the UK and other countries. You know, so this is really much more to do with discrimination against the poor, considering them uneducated, inarticulate, violent, thieving, dangerous, and so on, rather than necessarily about race. But America tends to conflate the two. But the discrimination is a result of the circumstance and how people emerge from that circumstance. So are people different? Do they attain to different levels? Certainly, socialism, left-wing thought doesn't say otherwise. What it wants to remove are the societal context and problems. I mean, if you're a genius and you're born into a very poor family with a very poor diet, poor access to education and so on, that genius is unlikely to flower and to blossom to the full potential that it could. Whereas if you were born into a rich family and were a genius, you would have access to the best food, the best education, you would be more likely to grow up fit and healthy, you'd have access to healthcare, all these other things, you're more likely to survive all the way to adulthood, and for that genius to blossom out into the world and thoroughly. And socialism looks at this situation and says, well, yeah, this genius born into poverty is being wasted. So we should take steps to ensure that poor families have good access to education, to nutrition, to healthcare and safety and so on, so that everyone, on the basis of their ability rather than anything else, has the capacity to flourish fully to the maximum level of their potential. So what the left is talking about is unfair discrimination. Now, there are lunatics out there who take this too far. We've all heard about the cotton ceiling when it comes to transgender people, that they regard this as being prejudice, that people don't want to sleep with them. Whereas this is a matter of personal taste and desire. You just may not want to sleep with a trans person for whatever reason, and you're perfectly entitled to not sleep with them because it's your body. You should be able to decide what you do with it. They will characterize that as discrimination, and for some people it may well be, but that's not unfair discrimination as it would be if they were denied a job because of their transgender status rather than their capability to do the job. So it's important to understand these distinctions and differences.
And discrimination causes oppression. The majority group always treats the minority group with prolonged, cruel or unjust treatment or control, which is a standard definition of oppression. What's interesting is they don't have many interesting definitions of the word oppression. They've got a redefinition for almost every word, but oppression is not one of them. But oh, they do. Oh, no. And almost every ideology is guilty of this, by the way. Almost every ideology starts with, I have a new definition for a standard English term, and that's what we're going to work with going forward. And that's why so many ideologies seem absolutely batty. But obviously the second one is those who benefit from inequality have privilege. One person's benefit is automatically another person's deficit. Resources are finite, and systemic redress of imbalance is just. Compared to the reality that minority groups are quite capable of oppressing majority groups. That's in fact what social justice warriors are. A minority group that is oppressing the majority, the rest of society, making sure that if anyone steps outside of line, they get it. They get it as hard and fast as they can. But I mean, I'm preaching to the choir. You guys all have seen this happening on Twitter or in your social lives, at work, wherever you've been. You all know this happens. Everybody has benefits and disadvantages from inequality because people are all different, you know. And I can't remember who said it, but Jordan Peterson mentioned it. It's a really great point. Would you rather be an immigrant or would you rather be ugly? It's like, oh, that's interesting, isn't it? No one wants to be ugly, you know. No one wants that. So, you know, if we're going to start talking about privileges and oppressions, let's start with the ones that we can all agree on. But resources are effectively not finite. Now, I know that sounds controversial, and systemic redress of imbalances is unjust because, I mean, okay, I've put there are no injustices to rectify. There are individual injustices to rectify. But systemically, I don't think there are at this point. And I don't think that you can really point to anything. Okay, maybe you can think of a few things. I'll probably get called up on this at some point. But essentially, for most people, there really isn't that much you can do.
Here we see some of the really major divergences from actual left-wing thought. The idea that the majority automatically oppresses the minority is kind of backwards to how left-wing thought tends to think. What left-wing thought is against is the idea that a minority of the wealthy or the powerful or the blue-blooded or whatever else should get to dictate through force, usually, how everyone else lives. The oppression is the unjust application of force, really, when you boil it down. So when a policeman arrests you for doing something criminal, that is just, that is not oppression, though the law itself might be an ass, complicating matters. If policemen stop you doing something perfectly innocent just because they have the power to do so, something unfair, something that doesn't harm anyone, you can start to make an argument that that is oppression. Now, oppression can happen in any direction from any group. It's that unjust application of power. I would argue personally that social justice warriors are oppressive because they are a tiny minority of people with a vast amount of social capital which they wield incredibly unjustly to silence, bully and control others. So the left has traditionally been about liberalizing ideas, liberalizing what you can do, liberating people from oppression to live more freely, which is why the left has always been associated with extensions of rights, civil rights for people of colour, for immigrants, for gays, for whatever else. That's why, because it necessarily seeks to counter oppression. And minorities can suffer from prejudice and so on, but the way that the left-wing thought tends to tackle that is in trying to remove those social and class-based means by which they are constricted and oppressed and controlled, so that they can flourish the same as everybody else. That's what it seeks to do, always, is to raise everyone up so that everyone has the maximum opportunity to flourish, and a bottom layer that's as low as you can sink, and it's livable and not just terrible. Now, I did cut out a section there in the middle where Sargon goes off on a tangent about how wealth, resources, if you will, aren't finite. Well, they are finite. Even if you take it to the absolute maximum level, the universe is only so big and will only exist for so long. So necessarily, it's finite. Even taken to that scale, even assuming we could exploit every resource in the universe, we would eventually run out. The fact is that accessible resources are finite, and the amount of time and the amount of energy that each of us can expend in our lifetimes is finite. So think of it more as a machine. A machine can put out a certain amount of power, and you can run so many tools off that power plant, say, before it goes kaput. Some machines take more power, some take less. In terms of economics, in terms of society, what we have are people taking more power from that hypothetical engine as it's producing it, even if it produces more day on day. They're taking more, and other tools that maybe need as much or more are taking less. Let's drop the analogy because it makes it difficult. A common complaint from people on the libertarian right is about being taxed. They say, didn't I earn that money? Don't I deserve all that money? This is not functionally really any different from a left-wing, even a Marxist cry that aren't the workers entitled to the full value of their work. I mean, the way capitalism necessarily operates is that the person in charge of the business is creaming off money from everyone beneath him. You could view your employer as a taxman quite justifiably, and furthermore, you're probably not getting anything like as much back from your employer as you are from your government in terms of assistance, roads, I know you love roads, and all of these other things that the government has to provide for you, you know, that you voted to get. You know, your tax gets used. The wealth that your boss takes quite often doesn't end up used, doesn't get reintroduced. Often it quite just sits there. So if your argument against tax is, aren't I entitled to the sweat of my brow, the same can be said for private industry, and a lot of trade unionism, a lot of Marxism, a lot of left-wing thought as a whole, even though I'm trying to avoid talking about Marxism because it's not the whole of the left, is about redressing that balance, saying, doesn't the worker deserve something closer to the full value of their work that they do? And all of our work is finite, and shouldn't we get more from it? It's interesting to see that same argument, just with a different target, appears on two different political poles.
So we get to our conclusions, at least from this first part. The far-left worldview is dogmatic and does not model reality accurately. Their predictions are wrong because of their faulty premises. They will respond that the empirical claims to reality that we have demonstrated are also ideological. They believe the scientific method itself is ideological. And because of the contradictions between progressive ideology and reality, many problems are emerging that the progressives cannot actually solve. And that's what we'll be talking about.
And from there, Sargon dives deep into the postmodernist crazy end of things and stops even pretending to be talking about any ideological collapse of the left. There's been no ideological collapse of the left. There has been an usurpation by an irrational ideology, which is kind of a mirror image of the irrational ideology on the right. You know, when we said reality has a left-wing bias, here's what I meant by that. We know that social investment works. We know that socialized healthcare provides better outcomes for the majority of people. You know, there are other instances of this that show that in many instances, collectivization of effort, economy of scale and so on, all work much better than the alternative. I mean, there's nothing that he brought up there about the nature of people or inequality and so on that I think we can actually disagree on, but it's how you deal with these things where Sargon seems to be shifting to the right. Do we just let people rot? You know, what do we do? If we have the means as a society to provide healthcare for all, shouldn't we do it? Just as you shouldn't just drive past someone who's been hit by a car, you know? It's on you to stop and help them, really. Or if you hear a distress call while you're out sailing or whatever else it might be, you know, there is an onus upon us to help each other. And there is this useful thought exercise of thinking, well, okay, if I was to be born into any society, and it could be at any level of that society, to any parents, any social situation, what society would I want to be born into? One where I had access to a good education, one where I had access to healthcare, one where I had access to housing, you know, I wouldn't end up on the street or whatever else. You know, these are good questions to ask to help us figure out what is a fair and just society. Yeah, there are differences between people, there are inequalities. Some of them are innate, most of them aren't. And the ones that aren't innate, we can address. And that is the thrust and the meaning behind the equality that socialism talks about. You know, whether you're rich or poor, you should be treated the same by the courts. You know, if you're disabled, you have a basic right to human dignity and an ability to live some kind of life that's of quality. We need to invest socially so that people aren't driven to crime and so on in order just to get by. And we want to make sure that people get something closer, at least, to the full value of their work, rather than having it leached away. And we want to oppose forces that would oppress us. Whether it be arch-capitalists like Rupert Murdoch influencing our politics through the media, or Russian oligarchs bribing our politicians. Any form of power that would seek to emerge and take control over us, to genuinely oppress us, we should oppose, or we should try to prevent coming about. So when it comes down to it, I think it's only really a matter of degree that we would disagree on, and I think we're united in our opposition to this postmodernist, social constructivist claptrap. And it's painful to see that being called left-wing thought, when it's anything but at all. And if you're a liberal, you should actually have a lot in common with socialists. Zang.